Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and welcome. Nice to be together. It's interesting to note that it has to go down to 45 degrees outside for it to feel warm in this sanctuary. As soon as the air conditioner is on, it's freezing in here. Before I begin my sermon for this week, I'll tell you that I, like most rabbis, think about next week's sermon as soon as the services are over on Shabbat morning. And I had a funny thought this week, and I decided I was going to pursue it. I decided not to. So this is the sermon I didn't give. I saw one episode of that Netflix interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Well, that was my feeling about it. But what I realized is that prince, maybe the prince has to leave the castle in order to be able to find his voice, his message, and his place in the world. So I was thinking about that in relation to the Prince of Egypt. And Moses is having to leave in order to be able to be effective in his world. One other thing about that, I know that the great poet Rumi spoke about a man, in order to be a man, has to leave his home and has to keep moving and keep walking and find his church until he can return back to his home. That's the sermon I'm not giving. And I wish the prince well. About 10 years ago, I went to Chicago, to Northwestern University, for a seminar at the well-known Kellogg Business School. It was a seminar that was being given for the first time to some synagogue rabbis, executive directors, and even a few synagogue presidents slipped in. The dean of that program had deep commitments to Jewish life, in addition to his scholarly work and the administrative work he did at the Kellogg School. Those commitments, however, never really overlapped. The work he did in the business school did not have much to do with his life as an active member of a shul, except in the area of ethics. At some point, his wife and he decided that there was so much to learn from the world of business and its studies, which would be able to influence people to work more efficiently in other areas of life, and they were thinking about their synagogue. It is the reason that experts from the world of business write so many self-help books that you see on the market. Books about how to be more effective, how to communicate better, how to run a better operation, be it your home or be it your office. As two people who were engaged in their synagogues, they began to think about the fact that synagogues were not the most efficiently run institutions. They don't necessarily administer efficiently. They don't necessarily market their brand very well. Their message is not often spoken very effectively. And so they indicated, as you look around, one can notice that so many synagogues are not doing well and they're failing. One of the things that I learned at that conference in Chicago 10 years ago was that every successful organization or business has an elevator speech. Now that's an expression that most of you, if not all of you, have heard before. 10 years ago, I never heard that expression before. But you know what an elevator speech is. It's a talk whereby you can describe your essence or your purpose, your essential values between the first floor and perhaps the 10th floor. And that is what you have to sell. I ask myself that question quite frequently. What is our elevator speech? What do we have that attracts young adults and the next generation that will keep a community vibrant, alive? I'd like to throw the question out to you, and I think it's something we could speak more about, perhaps at one Kiddush. By the way, this is the first time I've ever seen anyone fan themselves in this institution. I'm going to hold on to that image when people complain to me about how cold it is here. But I would like to hear from you. Send me an email. Tell me what you think our elevator speech is. Because the truth is, we are facing very, very difficult and challenging times, not just in the synagogue, but in this world. And I don't think that we are approaching it at the synagogue with enough passion and a call for responses that are necessary. We are doing our best, I will tell you, but I think we need to do more. A feature of my rabbinate has been rooted in the belief that we take our rituals and our texts and we try to discover the meaning of them, not just understanding their origins, but what are they saying to us now as we sit here? What is most important about that which we do? What does it say to our lives, and what's it saying to the world out there? There's obviously a deep personal resonance in this for me, and almost all of us feel that in different ways. And it obviously has social, familial, and political implications also. So I'll be personal for a moment. And it's something that I mentioned last night. When I was a child, perhaps I was 8 years old or 9 years old, my mother took me to hear a speaker. It was about 1962 or 63. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. And he was speaking at our high school, the high school in our town, Central High School. And I recall very well, as I said last night, not what he said, but how his speech made me feel. And I sensed that I was listening to a deeply religious speech, and one that I and everyone sitting there resonated to. As I got a little bit older, it became very obvious to me that his message is an Exodus message. It's a Shemot message. It's a Pesach message. It was biblical, and it was very real. It was a message for the time. I came of age during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam years. And I remember very vividly hearing rabbis, my rabbi, speak about the war, and speak about peace, and speak about justice, and speak about freedom. And the messages were so deeply connected to what I was learning was the essential values message of both the Torah and the prophets. And so when I look at the Torah as a whole, I found some and find some elevator speeches. And perhaps the most important of all is a speech about power. I believe a central reason for the formulation of ethical monotheism that goes back to Abraham and what we understand from the time that this Torah was written has to do that we witnessed and were subjects of the corruption of power. Throughout history, there have been autocratic leaders and empires who have claimed their ultimate power and neglected those who didn't have power. Worse yet, oppressed those. We don't accept that. We didn't accept that. And in fact, throughout our history, we were victimized by it. For we believe that ultimate power lies in only one place, and that is in God. That's the beginning of ethical monotheism. Because we believe in the adage that if power corrupts, then ultimate power corrupts ultimately, and does destroy. And so we developed as a people and a tradition with a different sense about power and how people in leadership are to use power. A different sense about who we can control and how we control them. It started from the very beginning, from the historical beginnings of the shaping of Judaism that took place in Babylonia. And we might even realize that it's related to the beginning of our year. Did you know that Rosh Hashanah, that high holy day actually evolved amongst the people Israel as a function of an annual coronation ceremony of the sovereign of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled with cruelty and absolute authority. He was the king. He was the sovereign. He was the God. But our people saw things differently. They understood there was one ultimate sovereign king. It couldn't have a human form. It couldn't be seen. But it was part of our aspirations. Our ancient ancestors in exile held on to a notion of one God, one sovereign, without a human form. That was Melech HaOlam, the King of the universe. And it was meant in many ways to provide a defense against oppression and abusive rulers, abusive governance. So what's the elevator speech? It's a speech about one God and the implication on the limits of human power, authority, and control. Power is a central consideration in the Torah. And as things have it, it is today also. In this week's Parsha, we see that the all-powerful Pharaoh can do what he wants to do, and his paranoia about his power being threatened enables him to decree that baby boys should be thrown into the river. This Pharaoh, the symbol of power, he can enslave and he can abuse. The counterforce, the antithesis, has been a small people who came from the other side of the river. A very small people. Ivrim they were called, Hebrews. A people who have always been the other. And no doubt that led to vulnerability and was reflected in weakness. Yet we remained a force in the world, perhaps because we were a reminder to the world about the sovereignty of one God. But from that position as Hebrews, as others, as former slaves, as a minority, we taught the world some of its most important ethical lessons. And I dare say, we were challenged to learn the lessons of the powerful, perhaps because we were powerless. Perhaps. Perhaps it was because one day we would be a people with power, and we could show the world how a people with power and strength and influence are to behave. And so the question to be asked is, how would we act when we have control of our own destiny, when we are strong, when we have wealth, when we have influence? How do we use our power? And that's the question. And before it's too late is the question that we need to be asking ourselves today, these days. Back to the Parsha. So, enter Puah and Shifra. Shifra and Puah. The midwives. They might have been Jewish. Perhaps they weren't Jewish. It's a discussion amongst the rabbis. But they were willing to risk their lives, their entire beings, on saving newborn Hebrew boys because they feared God, as the Torah says. We don't know much about them, but we know they were women of courage. In fact, the rabbis in the Midrash said they were worthy of being redeemed from Pharaoh, and that we were worthy of being redeemed from Pharaoh and slavery because of these midwives. It was the women that led to our redemption. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have become what we became and who we are? Could it be because women and men relate to power differently? Could it be because women are more willing to act cooperatively? And what we learn from our commentators is that Shifra and Puah represented the very first act of civil disobedience. Over time, what we have learned is that in the face of power, the ability to stand up and protest in civil disobedience against forces greater than our own when we are hopeless may be the only answer that brings about the change that's necessary, the change to give the powerless a voice. This week, after watching the news from around the world, the news from Iran, reading about the news from Israel, the news from Brazil, the news from many places in the world, I've given a lot of thought to the issues of the powerful and the powerless. I've given consideration to the models of people who will stand up for the sake of a greater good, not just for their own power. And so I read some of the works from models of civil disobedience that shaped the last century and the way that liberal democracies were preserved in this world. Mahatma Gandhi was an Indian lawyer, anti-colonial nationalist, a political ethicist who employed nonviolent resistance to lead a successful campaign for India's independence from British rule and later inspire movements for civil rights and freedom across the world. Gandhi stood up to imperial forces much greater than himself, much greater even than the people he represented. He did so with peaceful and silent protests, and by doing so, he inspired a national transformation towards self-determination in India. One act, one man, an act of defiance, moments of civil disobedience. What we saw in this morning's Parsha was the very first act of civil disobedience. We know about his disciple also, Nelson Mandela. He spent 20 years of his life in jail because he stood up to power, because he cried out for freedom and the equality of his people. And he remained committed to nonviolence because he had a quiet confidence that truth was on his side, and there couldn't be justice without truth. He was a man of faith. He believed that power was in that which was right and fair and just. And after years imprisoned in South Africa, he emerged a hero, became a president, and continued to advocate for nonviolence. He led a movement for truth and reconciliation. We understand that we never absolutely get to our goals, but we work to try to achieve them. We aspire for them. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. He taught that education is the most powerful weapon which can be used to change the world. And he also taught it is in your hands, every one of you, to make a better world for all who live in it. He said a winner is a dreamer who never gives up. And overcoming poverty is not a task of charity. It is an act of justice. Like Gandhi, he had a major influence on many of the transformational moments of the 20th century. And in our own nation, as you know, on Monday we will observe a national holiday dedicated to the life and to the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King led a peaceful revolution, one, we might add, which is not yet over. He was dedicated to the principles of nonviolence in his battle for civil rights, not just for African Americans, but all Americans, and all people in their struggles for just wages and recognition. He was dedicated to the Torah's notion that we cannot sit idly by in the face of injustice or oppression. And that was given a powerful, I'll second this emotion, by his friend and his teacher, and admittedly our teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel. For Heschel reminded us that we can never sit idly by when we witness injustice. He spoke about his own march in Alabama, where he said his feet were praying. And that was his expression of the holiness of engagement in protest. In 1963, Heschel wrote a magnificent letter to then President John F. Kennedy. And he urged our president, our leader, to act with moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. Such beautiful words. He spoke to power, reminding the president that he had a responsibility to help the movement for civil rights and racial equality in this nation, to stand up to the powerful forces of racism. Today, there's a sense of being overwhelmed by the forces that subvert democracy and human rights. We saw this horrendous attack on the Congress and the judiciary and the president's home in Brazil by anti-democratic forces of Bolsonaro. They were following the extreme right's game plan. They obviously saw it here. We witnessed the power of Orbán in Hungary and the cruelty and unstoppable desire for control of Putin. We see the struggle against a theocracy and totalitarian regime in Iran that has no sense of the sanctity of life at all. And today, tragically and sadly, we're witnessing anti-democratic forces in our Israel taking hold, led by demagogues who have a thirst for power, who want a theocracy, who want to destroy a judiciary that cannot be quenched and it cannot be quenched, and they have a disregard for those without the power. Our world is in need of a paradigm shift. And this week's Torah reading reminds us of all of this by the example of a demagogue who knew not Joseph and his descendants, and nothing would stop this crazed Pharaoh from destroying all of those that he was threatened by. The call during a time such as this, as Americans and as Jews and as Zionists, is to use the power that we do have to raise our voices in protest, to give the support that we can give to those people and those organizations which stand for justice and the basic rights of all individuals and all people. Had Shifra and Puah done nothing, the greatest movement for freedom in the world and the movement towards one God would never have happened. Sometimes the most important work begins with simple individuals, in this case midwives, who remind themselves and us that the time is now, that we have to take a position, that we have to use our voices and work against the hate-filled voices and the fascism that surrounds us. Tonight, undoubtedly, there will be protests in Tel Aviv. Tens of thousands, if not 100,000, will gather. And we must know that those protesting are acting upon a call that we first heard in the book of Exodus. It's about a response to power and how it ultimately belongs to God but respects the lives of all human beings. God willing, the year ahead will bring peace. We'll see the growth of democracy and justice. We'll see it spread and prevail. God willing, the people of Ukraine will be freed from this horrific, powerful Putin. In the meantime, however, may we live with a sense of being inspired by our capacity for spiritual grandeur and moral audacity. And may that message grow inside of us, inside of our souls and our spirits, and may it inspire our actions in whatever little way we can act. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.